My name is David Leopold, and I teach political theory in the Department of Politics and International Relations in the university. I'm also a tutor here at Mansfield, and my college fellowship, like today's lecture, is named after John Milton. My research is not directly concerned with Milton, but I'm very pleased to have that association. Not least in a sign of the times in which we live, I have political theory colleagues in other colleges whose posts are named after oligarchs, Len Blavatnik, and pension fraudsters, Robert Maxwell. In contrast, Milton, or so it seems to me, has many happier and more appropriate associations, not least for political theorists. He's thought of as a powerful defender of the free press and a sophisticated advocate of Republican freedom. We should probably admit that Milton's connections with Mansfield are a little indirect, but they are eminently material. Milton was an inspirational figure to the non-conformists who established the college in the late 19th century. They viewed him as something as a spiritual and intellectual fellow traveller who could lend his intellectual authority to their own educational endeavours. And they built Milton into the very fabric of the college. Milton appears nearly life-sized in the stained glass of the chapel, in the second of the west-facing windows, and it's his statue, which you can see but not really make out very clearly, high up on the face of the tower above the entrance door to the original college buildings. These are dangerous times to be a statue. In Bristol, Colston, you risk being thrown into the harbour. In Grantham, Thatcher, you risk being egged. And in Oxford, Rhodes, you can be subjected, well, to bland contextualising labels and evasive reports which take many, many years to produce. But Milton, I think, is safe from all of those threats. This annual lecture and my college fellowship are named after Milton at the request of Charles and Caroline Brock. The Brocks worked at Mansfield for 35 years before returning to their home in the United States, and they made a huge contribution to the life of the college during that time. It's very typical that when subsequently they became generous benefactors to Mansfield, they didn't want their own name given prominence, but the name of one of their heroes. I'm pleased to see a few people in the audience who, like myself, will remember Charles from his time as a fellow and tutor at Mansfield. But for those who don't, I'd like to stress the central role that Charles played in helping Mansfield actually become the kind of friendly and open community that Oxford colleges always say they are, but don't always actually manage to be. He knew everyone and everyone knew him, and in those daily interactions with others, Charles demonstrated both his huge love for life and his heartfelt conviction that serious learning and having fun were compatible. It's a great pleasure to welcome Charles and Mary today, and to thank Charles for agreeing to give this year's Milton lecture. His chosen title is Milton and Jefferson on Education, Tyranny and Superstition. Thank you.
Thank you, David, for a wonderful introduction. I want a copy of that. I want to prove one or two things to myself, and that will help. And thank you, Helen, and the college for inviting me for this. I really appreciate it. My sentimental attachment to Mansfield and to Wheatley, where I was minister for 35 concurrent years with my job here at the college, meant everything to me, and really was the highlight of my life, and Carolyn's too. And so we're, in that sense, I'm really happy to be back and to introduce Mary, my wife now, to the college, though she's been here once before, 4 years ago, and the last time I was here because of COVID. It's terrific to be able to see you and to meet again, and hope that that can continue. I was just reminding Helen and others, Lucinda, David, that I think I gave the first Milton lecture 20 years ago. It was on Milton and Jefferson on education. And I'd forgotten that I'd done that. And so but I took a look at the lecture and I thought, gosh, what I'm doing now is just about 90% different from what I said 20 years ago. And that's because times have changed, and the interpretation of Milton and Jefferson in the context of today, for me, has radically changed. So that was 20 years ago. 20 years from now, if you'd like to invite me back, I'll only be 107. So that would be fun to repeat the same topic with different results. The other thing I'd like to say about Mansfield is that we had a really unusual history. And when I came in 1962, it was essentially a seminary. And John Marsh, the principal at the time, had this vision of expanding the college, not simply for financial means, but because seminarians ought to be trained within the context of science, literature, and philosophy, politics, and so on. And so that was the original vision of the college, which I really strongly supported and helped as much as I could to get that vision off the ground. But it was the 6 fellows who were appointed by John Marsh and others who really got things started. John Creaser and Tony Lemon, Michael Frieden, Mike Marney, who's since passed on, Anthony Ogus, and they were the ones who were the drivers behind getting the college sorted out in the university as a full college, as well as a splendid college with terrific results. So they are to be thanked enormously, and I value their friendship, and I value the history of the college in that way. The only time I was invited to All Souls for dinner was a number of years ago when one of my tutors at Harvard, Professor Heiko Augustinus Obermann, had come over for a sabbatical and was at All Souls, and he invited me in for dinner. I'd never been. I knew about All Souls. It's a famous place, to say the least. And so the warden wasn't in that night, and it was the senior fellow who was presiding at dinner, who was a Beethoven scholar. But he was old and cranky, and I could see I was in for a difficult time. I was the only guest. And Heiko Obermann said, "This," he was a Dutchman, "this is Charles Brock, Harvard and Mansfield." And the senior fellow said, "I've heard of Harvard." I walked into a trap, and I said, "Oh, well, Mansfield, you come out of All Souls, and you turn right on Hollywell, and you walk up Mansfield Road, and there's the Geography Center, there's Manchester College, the Virology Lab, and the science buildings all over, and Mansfield is right there." "Oh," he said, "I never go in that direction." Well, Mansfield has shown the direction for a number of Oxford events and ideas, and I'm so grateful that that's the case. Two of the brightest stars in the Western firmament were Milton and Jefferson, who became fundamental for Western democracy. They were Renaissance and Reformation polymaths with wide-ranging interests from poetry to politics and all things in between. Both men were radical revolutionaries. Milton about the rights of English nonconformity under Charles I, and Jefferson about American oppression under George III. Milton was the intellectual guide to the English Revolution. Cromwell used him to explain England to Europe, and that's not an easy task. Jefferson was crucial for the American Revolution. They were both bad on slavery, agreeing with Aristotle, Augustine, and Aquinas that natural slavery, that is, some civilizations were destined to slavery because of their faults, was okay. They had some points of disagreement among themselves on many issues, including education, But they wrote and acted on education pretty much in consort. Jefferson founded a college, the University of Virginia, and they wrote and acted upon education in big ways. Jefferson founded a college to compete with the Ivy League, which he believed offered a terrible education, not unlike the formation of Mansfield, for making education serious in Oxford compared to rich kids finishing schools. There is the picture of Milton on the top of the tower overlooking the quad. The purpose of this paper is to illustrate 2 points. The first is that Milton and Jefferson had a broad view of education that was similar. College was for the elite, and they were okay with that. But they wanted an inclusive education, not specialization. The second is that they both insisted that major purpose of education, a major purpose, was to educate leaders who were sympathetic to republicanism, small r, and would work hard to save the nation from tyranny and superstition, including anti-scientific or magical thinking. It appears that we have very different concerns from their past compared to today. In short, in the 17th and 18th centuries, education was tried to be about the dissemination of knowledge and to stop and to help young people take charge, or at least be aware of the nation. It's the opposite today. Job training and intellectual and individual fulfillment are the flavors of the day. But with the US veering toward a white supremacist, kleptomanic government, and Russian oligarchs and their lawyers chuckling as they buy up London, and many other countries moving toward authoritarianism, we may need to rethink our education at the moment. I begin with a story of Viscount Anthony Wedgwood Benn, just to show 1 or 2 pictures there, known as Tony Benn, the labor radical, father of the House of Commons, an anti-royalist, left-wing proponent and guardian of working class values. Tony Benn once came to Mansfield to preach. His mother, Lady Stansgate, who was on our council, accompanied him. Both of them, in my opinion, represent the best of what the college had to offer at that point. Democratic politics and churchmanship, sympathy for the middle class, critique of the wealthy, fear of hierarchy and monarchy, and strong support of the school and college for all, regardless of family background. Tony Benn gave a suitably radical sermon based on Amos 5. Let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. That is, beneficial worker politics, as he interpreted it. We usually got 20 people for a Wednesday sermon. 600 students attended that event. We usually did not advertise. We didn't advertise that program, but the word got around. Tony Benn was asked in the discussion period after dinner what he thought of the kingdom of God. And he puffed on his pipe and said, "Call it the Republic of God, and I might be interested." Lady Stansgate was a bit embarrassed about her son challenging a central biblical idea and sent a letter of thanks with a P.S. I'm slipping Anthony some notes on the kingdom of God. But that is just what Milton wanted. He wanted a republic of God. It applied to education and schools, to colleges, universities, as well as churches and family life. Let me flesh that out. place where Milton lived in Forest Hill for a while, close to my church in Wheatley, just to show you one or two things. Let me flesh that out, what he meant. As I said, the true aim of education was to train men and man as the citizen. It must prepare him for in the arts and sciences useful to private and civic life. It should awaken the sense of religion and love of country with analysis of its virtues and vices. It must inflame him, he said, with the high hopes of living to be a brave man and worthy patriot. Scientific knowledge, practical skill, moral elevation, such is the threefold nature of education, and this must always be kept before the teachers, unquote. He also sought a good awareness of the manual arts. In other words, a general education was to be pushed. Above all, he wanted republicanism and equality for non-conformists and a free press for England. As he said, the study of politics, to know the beginning and reasons of political societies, that they may not be a dangerous fit of the Commonwealth, the poor Commonwealth, shaken, uncertain reeds of such a tottering conscience as many of our great counselors have lately shown themselves, but steadfast pillars of the state, unquote. Tyranny and superstition, as I said above and emphasize again, were to be the two major concerns for the nation. He wrote a 5-page document called Of Education, John Milton. I'm afraid that this starting point would not be acceptable to the universities of Europe and America today when he said, quote, "The end of learning is to repair the ruins of our first parents by regaining to know God aright, and out of that knowledge to love him, to imitate him, to be like him, as we may the interest of possessing our world of true virtue, being united with the heavenly grace of faith makes up the highest perfection," unquote. But if you demythologize that, for now, it leads to the question of what is education for? And understanding our parental ruins will be terribly important. To know the bad stuff is just as important as the good stuff, and not let colleges lead us into a jolly, saccharine vision of life, like most commencement addresses. And some terribly nice teachers do the same. Here's the big argument, in my opinion, of education by Milton. I would point ye out the right path of a virtuous and noble education, laborious indeed at the first account, but else so smooth, so green, so full of goodly prospect, and melodious sounds on every side, that the harp of Orpheus was never more charming. I call, therefore, a complete and generous education that which fits a man to perform justly, skillfully, and magnanimously all the offices, both private and public, of peace and war, unquote. He places philosophy, especially the Greeks, religion, especially the Hebrews, natural science, economics, poetry, music, languages, and the practical sides as well. Quote, to set forward all these proceedings in nature, mathematics, but also the hunters, fowlers, fishermen, shepherds, gardeners, apothecaries, and those in other sciences, architects, engineers, mariners, anatomists, who doubtless would be ready for some reward and some favor for such a hopeful seminary, unquote. He was interested in self-development and coined the phrase self-esteem as a contemporary concept as there is, and one that governed much of Milton's life. He attacked subjects such as trade school courses that should not be in college, for example, law. And he said, some allured to the trade of law, grounding their purposes not on the prudent and heavenly contemplation of justice and equality, which was never taught them, but on the promising and pleasing thoughts of fat contentions and flowing fees. Others betake themselves to state affairs with souls so unprincipled in virtue and true generous breeding that flattery, the court shifts, and tyrannous aphorisms appear to them the highest points of education. Unquote. Echoes of this critique were in the American Revolution from the lawyer James Madison, the generator of the Constitution, when he said, "Is there no virtue among us? If there be not, we are in a wretched situation." And good use should be made of the great literature and poetry and cut out some of the rubbish that's published. Milton said, "This would make them soon perceive what despicable creatures our common rhymers and playwriters be, and show them what religious, what glorious and magnificent use might be made of poetry, both in divine and human things." Unquote. And to show his relevance to the Americans, the Atlantic magazine featured an article on Milton in America Now. Quote, "Many of the values of the archangel Satan advocates in Paradise Lost, the self-reliance, the rugged individualism, and even manifest destiny, are regarded as quintessentially American in the cultural imagination. Milton may have been a poet of individual liberty and conscience, but he was also one of the most brilliant theological explorers of the darker subjects of sin, depravity, and inclination toward evil. America seems prefigured in Milton's pamphlets when he defended regicide and defended freedom of speech." Unquote. I also like Milton on sports. There must be, practiced in all locks and grips of wrestling, W-R-A-S-T-L-I-N-G, wherein Englishmen were wont to excel, as need may often be fight to tug or grapple and to close, the interim of unsweating oneself regularly and conventional rest before meat may be both with profit and delight taken up in the recreating and composing their travailed spirits with the solemn and divine harmonies of music, heard or learnt, either while the skillful organist plays his grave and fancied descant in lofty figures, or the whole symphony with artful and unimaginable touches adorn and grace the well-studied chords of some choice composer." Unquote. My late wife, who was organist for 30 years in our beautiful Mansfield chapel, might have agreed, and now that we use the chapel as a dining hall and the organ is well repaired and tuned, we could repeat this at dinner so we all could be duly unsweated. Milton praised the vigorous life as more than sports and said this, "I cannot praise a fugitive and cloistered virtue, unexamined and unbreathed, that never sallies out and sees her adversary, but slinks out of the race where the immortal garland is to be run, for not without dust and heat, that which purifies us in trial, and trial is by what is contrary." Unquote. Milton's favorite sport, and one of his tutorial students. In 1660, after the revolution had collapsed, part of a campaign to expunge the recent Republican past, Milton's books were to be sent to the flames by the order of the king. Again, in 1683, in the climate of fear of a supposed plot against Charles II, the Convocation at Oxford voted to burn Milton's books among a list of subversive material. What did Jefferson want for education? In Thomas Jefferson's library, commonplace book, his diary in other words, Milton appears more than any other poet. They are close on education, as I've said. It was used to bring equality by raising up an educated and talented aristocracy, quote unquote, to run the country not based on birth and wealth. Jefferson said this: the advantages of a well-directed education, moral, political, and economical, are truly above all estimate. Education generates habits of application, of order, of love of virtue. It was a means for promoting social happiness, moving society beyond barbarism, and training able counselors to administer the affairs of our country in all departments, and advancing the prosperity, the power, and happiness of a nation, unquote. So Jefferson and Milton had all that in common. And they wanted languages, math, politics, history, literature, religion, poetry, music, art, gardening, and sports. Here was Jefferson's schedule for a lawyer's education. From dawn till 8 a.m., science, religion, and ethics. From 8 to noon, law. From 1 until dinner in the evening, politics and history. After dinner, literature. And music when you can. Like Milton, they were to be used for the common good, and it would make also the individual into somebody interesting. The state should educate all young people equally, teaching them to be conscious of their equal rights as individuals and their collective rights as a generation that will one day govern itself. Joe Monchenka, who's a Milton scholar in Oxford, points out that Jefferson may well have used Milton for the Declaration of Independence. The first draft, Jefferson wrote, quote, "We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable, that all men are created equal and independent," unquote. Milton's words were spikier. "No man knows aught, can be so stupid as to deny that all men naturally were born free, being the image and resemblance of God himself," unquote. Milton and Jefferson were all for the separation of church and state, and one of the reasons for the later break with Cromwell was because the Lord Protector wanted a close relation of Crown and the Geneva collar. Jefferson did not want the teaching of religion in schools or colleges, which often dominated the other American universities at the time. In place of the central chapel, he built a library. And Mansfield got it right with the chapel and library equal in size. Well, almost. The chapel is a little bit bigger. Like Milton, Jefferson was rooted in Second Isaiah and the Puritan understanding of the chosen nation, that is to bring justice and freedom to the world as well as to themselves. He was a providential deist and self-proclaimed Unitarian who believed that God was behind the revolution. Like Milton, he despised Presbyterians who wanted to reintroduce hierarchy, and he agreed with Milton, "New presbyter is but old priest writ large." Jefferson invited denominations to place seminaries close by the main campus and opened science courses to the seminarians. What he wasn't so good at was human rights, though he famously wrote "all men are created equal" in the Declaration of Independence. He was unable to apply that to his slaves. He did hate slavery and even trembled, as he said, before God in the effects that were going to happen for the nation. But unlike Milton, he did not see human depravity deeply enough or act on it. But the Republic of God was uppermost in their minds. John Creaser adds a fascinating note. Quote, "Something occurs to me in relation to Tony Benn and the Republic of God. The culmination of God's sublime image of eternity in Paradise Lost is that the Son will lay by his regal scepter and God will be all in all. That is, all are equally divine. a sort of republic of God. Today's universities, at least in America, are far from these ideals. Instead of community, we concentrate on jobs and the individual and his needs, or her needs and desires. Of course, we all need understanding and help of who we are. There are great courses in psychology and literature that will help us enormously. But this is secondary to the main purpose of personal and civic virtue and government. Most colleges insist on some smattering of the liberal arts in America, bits of science, bits here and there, which are often perceived as padding by the students. That's what I thought when we were forced to take history, English, and writing courses at Carnegie Mellon. We were there to get degrees in management, engineering, and architecture and the like, so we could make big bucks. We didn't want that stuff. But now I say all students should memorize poems along with Milton and work in gardens along with Jefferson. In order to root the teachers in this messy, nonlinear world, Cuba insists that its professors cut sugarcane in the summer vac. Ho ho, Oxford and Harvard. Reluctantly, I must admit my education at Harvard Divinity School in the early 60s was weird. We spent most of our time on European existentialism, Kierkegaard, Kafka, Camus, Buber, and so on, that emphasized knowledge of the self and its feelings. We were in Boston, home of the English Puritans, who rediscovered democracy and ignored its history. We also ignored the mega issues around us, building up in Vietnam, race, poverty, power of corporate America, Native American Holocaust. We looked at the subjectivity of human existence. It reminded me of a cartoon from long ago when a student complained to her teacher, "I don't want to know what Plato thought. I want to know what he felt." Harvard has moved on since I left town. It helped to start religious feminism, took a big part in racial issues, but Oxford has done it better. Oxbridge led the way with classics as the basic education, and PPE, politics, philosophy, and economics, shows the interrelationship between courses. You cannot learn political thinking without economics and philosophy, and vice versa. That's a real insight. Geography was added in 1887 to be an inclusive subject that included culture, economics, and natural sciences. But I didn't see that then. When I oversaw ministerial education here, I did drop German existentialism and ramped up the Bible and theology, which is very necessary, and emphasized pastoral care, world religions, and spirituality. That's important, of course. And a lot of churches primarily want pastoral counseling from a minister. And that's what most of chaplaincy is about. And Tony Tucker and I did a lot of counseling. But what we needed at that point was to bring in more politics, human rights, geography that included social issues, law, and English history, especially of the 17th century. It was all around me with terrific scholars at Mansfield in those fields, Creaser, Frieden, Lemon, Leopold, Rumsey, August, and our recent principals who were all involved in government. We used them somewhat, but we should have used them a lot more. Had we brought in politics and world issues and sociology, we might have been able, with Jefferson, to see that Jesus died because of insurrection, as he famously said. Essentially, we Freudianized Jesus, making him the psychiatrist who died with our transferred sins. More likely, he died as an insurrectionist. More Marx, less Freud. We did, however, do a lot of great music. with the students that would have pleased Milton and Bunyan, both hymn writers. How can we move forward? I think we can do a lot with these ideas from the past and use them now. We don't want our universities as trade schools or only teaching how to be happy and adjust to a tough world. The higher purpose for education is not only for individual fulfillment, but for national concerns. We want republicanism with a small r. Even if students study business, engineering, or medicine, we want them to be aware of the perils and problems of the day. This can be done in one course, but it mustn't be an elective. It should be required for everyone. We need a course or seminar for all students on the world's great issues as outlined in the handout that I've given. Who can teach it? Well, we could hire academic retirees aged 65 to 75, not older, who are willing to step out of their specialties and dip into other areas. Most are interested in the world and could handle this and make use of their already proven talents. I want to concentrate now on some thoughts about the rise of authoritarianism and take lessons from Milton and Jefferson on this. Tyranny? It cannot happen here, people say. But look at Germany in the 30s, the most scientific, musical, knowledgeable, and civilized nation in the world. Look what happened in a short time. Max Boot writes, quote, "When they are out of power, authoritarians will attack the state with every weapon at their disposal. Once they take power, however, they will entrench their own authority and repress dissent." Look at the right-wing ruling parties in India, Turkey, Hungary, and Poland, which the Republican in America increasingly resembles. Like them, the Republicans combine support for the free market, at least crony capitalism, with an illiberal social agenda, unquote. Robert Daniels, who's president of Johns Hopkins University, writes, "With democracy imperiled in so many nations around the world, including America, universities in the United States and Britain must act vigorously in defense of the ideas they represent," unquote. Populists want a hierarchical society of traditional morality and patriarchal family structure, with male-led households and are disciplined by an unrestrained free market. Abortion must be discussed as an example of lost rights, plus minority rule if Republicans take over and do not care about majority opinions. Here's some words from Maureen Dowd in the New York Times, who's the sharpest critic of all. Quote, "Samuel Alito's antediluvian draft opinion is the Puritans' greatest victory since they expelled Roger Williams from the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Alito helped open the door to dark money and helped gut the Voting Rights Act. But he wants to ban abortion largely because he says the Constitution does not expressly allow it. That's so fatuous and stupid. They are strict constructionalists, all right, strictly interested in constructing a society that comports with their rigid, religiously driven worldview. It's outrageous that 5 unelected, unaccountable, and relatively unknown political operatives masquerading as impartial jurists can so profoundly affect our lives," unquote. That is tyranny. If Roe versus Wade falls, the United States will join a small cadre of increasingly authoritarian countries that have become more restrictive on abortion in recent years. It's a slippery slope. Universities must rededicate themselves to education of democratic citizens. Robert Kagan, a leading American conservative, writes this: "A future Trump victory is likely to mean at least the temporary suspension of American democracy as we've known it." Madeleine Albright, who knows a thing or two about racism, says in her book Fascism, says in her book Fascism, "Watch your back." Emily Tankin writes, the American political right was long associated with Cold War hawkishness, but in recent years, the trend has shifted toward fawning praise for autocrats, even America's traditional adversaries, as well as projecting our own culture wars overseas. Supporting Mr. Putin, as well as other authoritarian leaders, is yet another way in which the political right is weaponizing culture wars to further divide Americans, unquote. Beware of dictators. One of Trump's press secretaries said this, I think he admired Putin greatly. I think he wanted to be able to kill whoever spoke out against him. In my experience with him, he loved dictators. He loved the people who could kill anyone, unquote. But the biggest conflict is over what kind of democracy the United States will be. White, Christian, male, or multiracial and multicultural. But if we let the right wing take over, that will intensify and reestablish the United States as a white, Christian, male, evangelical country. Also, Robert Reich, a former Rhodes Scholar next door, Secretary of Labor under Bill Clinton, wrote this. Donald Trump, who openly admired Chinese, Russian, and North Korean leaders while disparaging European allies, encouraged racist nationalism in the United States while delivering much of the government into the hands of America's super rich. If we only teach our students to be doctors, lawyers, merchants, and chiefs, or to be happy, 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 without any recognition of world and national issues, authoritarianism could happen all too soon. The American trends are scary. And if it goes wrong, we educators have ourselves to blame. We didn't follow our most sensitive historic leaders in education. Or we knew what to do, but we gave in to cultural and family forces that only want education to be fulfilling and to prepare, self-fulfilling, and to prepare our children for a wealth of things rather than ideas. In an article from Martin Luther King Jr., quote, we must remember that intelligence is not enough. Intelligence plus character, that's the goal of true education. The complete education gives one not only the power of concentration, but worthy objectives upon which to concentrate. If we are not careful, our colleges will produce a group of closed-minded, unscientific, illogical propagandists, consumed with immoral acts. Be careful, brethren. Be careful, teachers. That's what's happening in Britain now, according to Guardian contributor George Monbiot. He says, you can pass your exams, enter a top university, become a cabinet minister, yet fail to achieve basic standards of research, insight, originality, reasoned argument, empathy, or humanity. What exams measure is aptitude in exams, unquote. His attack is on the narrowness of school training for exams for college entry, but can also be applied to undergraduate education and finals at Oxford as well. It's a bad situation. Superstition. As I've said, this will be short. Milton and Jefferson attacked superstition. How does that relate to today? We have extraordinary and dangerous beliefs floating around. About 66 million Americans believe that aliens landed in Roswell, New Mexico. 12 million Americans believe that alien lizards rule us. 40% believe in ghosts. Trump has described himself as a very superstitious person. His followers are certainly on board. Superstition is basically anti-enlightenment, and here are some curt examples. People believe that hydrochloroquine will work for COVID because some internet charlatan claims that it does. People believe the 2020 election was stolen because a former president says so. Roughly 41 million Americans believe in the QAnon conspiracy theory, according to the survey from the Public Religion Research Institute. America is the only country where a significant proportion of the population believes that professional wrestling is real, but the moon landing was fake. According to some wealthy Florida residents I met this year, Anthony Fauci, the head of disease control, is only in it for the money. Even though he publishes financial statements, they believe he is overemphasizing the virus to make more money. People believe that Fauci killed people for the good of his stock market portfolio because it's implied by TV pundits, internet trolls, and even elected leaders. That is superstition in a modern vein. Irrationality is another name for it. We should follow Scott Chaplain, founder of Ragtime, when he wrote the piece Transmission in the 1910s, which is the story of a black woman in a small town who uses her education to coax her people away from belief in ghosts and charms, and the sinister peddlers who make their living selling crap to the naive. Sound familiar? Did you know that there's a Swiss political party dedicated to opposing the use of PowerPoint? Some words of Lee Drutman, slightly adapted. We are not sleepwalkers, fated for disaster. The recent epidemic of political pessimism has done something important. It has awakened us to where we might be headed if we don't make dramatic changes. The good news is that we're now waking up. We know the status quo is unacceptable, and this is cause for optimism, for leadership and education, to take us up and out of the ravine. Enough with pessimism. Let us turn this mess around. Oops. There we go. Yep. Sorry, I missed out on some of the pictures. To end with four anti-tyrannical heroes of mine, which I don't have the pictures for, unfortunately. Along with Milton and Jefferson, there is Harriet Tubman, the little old lady who personally crossed the Mason-Dixon line many times to free slaves and was called the Moses of her people, who will eventually replace King Andrew Jackson on the $20 bill. Lay preacher and farmer and political Calvinist John Brown, who lived in my neighboring Crawford County when he was conductor of the Underground Railroad and was the man, according to Lincoln, who sparked the Civil War. The Redeemer Abraham Lincoln, and the British keeper of the flame of the Republic, which I'm so sorry I can't show you right now, Tony Benn. Thank you kindly, Tom Muchley.
Well, thank you, Charles. I'd heard you were a great and broad-minded raconteur and polymath, and I think you proved that. I hope that Milton's link with Mansfield is a little bit more than just the statue, if maybe not an actual physical link of being here, but we do sit right on the Civil War ditch, and that side is the Royalists and New College, and they had an exhibition recently there, and I think the court moved into New College and didn't move out for years after the Civil War, so I like to think we're really beyond the pale. And I also hope that Milton would approve of the kind of education where we try to give people here today, where we do have poetry, teaching people to appreciate it, but also to write it, and politics, and physics, and people who stare at the stars. And if not wrestling, we do have rowing, and we do have Pilates, getting back to the P's. And I also hope that the author of Areopagitica would approve of at least the way we teach law, if not the fact that we do, emphasising the importance of a plural and tolerant and democratic society in which everyone is free and equal, which I hope is a bit of a bulwark against authoritarianism. And I also hope that Jefferson would approve of our attempt to make education relevant to people in an ethical sense, rather than just a sense of individual fulfilment, and creating a way in which people can participate in civil life. And I hope you'd like our gardens as well, which I think are quite nice. But Charles has kindly offered to take any questions or observations, so if anyone wants to join in the conversation, Shukri is here with a microphone, so if you maybe pop a hand up if you want to come, that'd be great to hear. I see a hand here. Asma's got a... Can you just wait for the microphone? It's coming.
Charles, it's great to see you. I mean, we were in college together. It's wonderful to have you back. Just a quick comment about Tony Benn. You will know that Tony Benn opposed the formation of the United Reformed Church. He spoke in Parliament. But his reason was that he said the House of Commons owes more to non-conformity and congregationalism than to any other institution. So, I mean, it was in the interest of democracy that he opposed us, but is partly under the influence, as you might know, of his mother, Lady Stansgate.
Yes, he certainly said that. I remember when he did that in House of Commons, spoke for 4 hours, I think. And it was really interesting that he brought that up. It's true. It was really the basis of democracy came from the English Revolution. America picked that up. And as you can tell from my paper, Jefferson was really secondary to Milton as far as understanding what was going on, and let alone putting it into words. But yeah, without the English Revolution, we would not have democracy today, either here or in the United States.
I see James Dingman's here, who's one of our honorary fellows who studied law here. I wonder, James, if you think you agree with Charles that we shouldn't teach law as a first degree, or to bring it into a wider context.
When I went to study law, I did all that you rightly deprecate. All I did was study the cases and think only of the future career. But Professor Buckley, who taught us law, taught and constitution, and it was his lectures and tutorials where he actually showed the importance of the state and our role in it that transformed my view. So I think, you know, law is not completely lost to academics.
That's right, and of course Milton was particularly pushing that point. But Jefferson, of course, was a lawyer and wanted the study of law above all for the United States. And America's become a very lawyer-dominated culture as far as Congress is concerned. Virtually most of the congressmen are lawyers and senators one way or another. So it's really taken over even more so than here as far as running the country is concerned. And a good law education, I think, you're right, I would agree. A good law education, jurisprudence in particular, rather than just contract law or tort or nuisance. I remember nuisance law. Richard Buckley was a specialist in nuisance law here. But jurisprudence is crucial for getting the country right again. And so, yes, support Jefferson rather than Milton on this point.
Glad to hear it.
Thank you very much. In this country, by dint of pressure of work, the creative subjects in schools in our own country are getting marginalized or pushed out altogether. Is this the same case in America?
Yes, very, very much so. It's so job-oriented in America that you really only learn specific skills, and you don't have any overview of what you're doing and why you're doing it. It's just, oh, you learn this and you'll be a good engineer. That was my education in my first degree. And it really was, as I say, they tried to make us learn one or two things in English and history and philosophy, but you know, we just paid no attention to it. We thought, we knew that they didn't believe in it themselves, you know, that there was just somebody said, the council said, you have to do this and you have to pass these exams to get through. But that's a terrible way of approaching it. And it should be fundamental to the university to do comprehensive training, education, I should use the word carefully, education, comprehensive education, not specialization. And on the sheet that I've given out, Woodrow Wilson was the biggest advocate of this. That he said, specialization is not for universities. He didn't like law or medicine in universities at all. because they were too specialized, though they don't need to be, as we were just saying. Rather, it should be a broad education with the classics, with languages, with philosophy, sociology, religion, politics in particular, in order to get the flavor of not only who you are, but what you can do and what you can accomplish for the society, which should be the university's first concern, not individual happiness and not specialization of a subject so you can get a good job.
Okay. I see one more hand there, and then I'll let you have a drink.
Thank you, Charles, for giving us such a kind of wide-ranging talk. I'm glad that you've mentioned virtue ethics, but I think virtue ethics has made a kind of comeback after kind of a century of utilitarianism and 2 centuries of sort of Kantian ethics. So I think we're sort of back to where the Greeks set us off as a more kind of holistic approach to ethics. The question I wanted to ask you was about Jefferson. I guess we can in Britain celebrate Milton as a hero, but Jefferson's standing in the American pantheon is probably more controversial at the moment.
Yes.
What do you, can you sort of share some thoughts about it? What do you feel about that? Because there's so much to admire, and yet, you know, there are problems.
There are certainly problems, excuse me, personal issues as well as national issues, slavery, of course, being the number one issue that people attack Jefferson on. Statues, as David said, it's dangerous to be in a statue these days. Jefferson has been torn down in a number of places. And they say he was a slave owner. And then he had his relationship with a slave, which produced 6 children, Sally Hemings. And I visited Monticello and saw the stairway where Sally goes from the slave quarters up spiral staircase into Jefferson's bedroom, and then comes spiraling back down again and produces yet another child. He did promise his wife he wouldn't remarry, so that was the solution to his sexual drives, which were very considerable. But personal lives, yes, he had a problem, but who doesn't? You know, just who doesn't? I mean, we all have issues. Every one of us. Nobody's perfect. But national issues, yes, equality only meant white male people. Women, slaves, and even some non-landowners were excluded from voting in the early days. It was only a gradual process that brought those people into the center of American life. And still, as I said, there are huge problems in the Republican Party of really wanting a male patriarchal society. That's what they want. They say so. And they're going to bust up voting in states that have large black Spanish populations because they mainly vote Democrat. And they're trying every trick in the trade. They say it. We're going to stop these people from voting. They even say it. I mean, it's just unbelievable that they would say it, let alone do it. But at least they're honest. They're honest by saying it's a terrible country and we have to have white males, Christian evangelicals to run the country. That's what the right wing wants. That's what they're saying. And that's not Jefferson. He wanted equality, at least in his highest flights of virtue. He wanted that to happen in America, and it's not quite there yet.
Okay. Well, thank you for a fascinating, if not Panglossian, approach to the virtues of Milton and Jefferson and why we should still think about them. Thank you all very much for coming. Next week, we have a talk about climate change, the last public talk of this term, so please come along to that if you would like to. And technical solutions to climate change, so trying to combine the technical and the ethical. But in the meantime, thank you all very much for coming. Do join us for a drink if you're coming for a drink, and thank you all very much, and thank you very much.
Thank you.
For your